The summer of 2020, after the George Floyd race riots, the United States in 2020 saw a 29% increase in homicide, the largest in this country's history.
Are illegal migrants causing a crime wave in the United States?
Actually, the illegal migrants themselves are not, their children are. There's a big difference when the left claims that, oh, well, immigration does not have any effect on crime. They've got a little bit of data on their side, although we don't have sufficient information really about who's in prison because the governments deliberately keep that sequestered and they don't ask. The problem is in the second generation, a large percentage of those illegal immigrant children end up joining the underclass culture. They get sucked into gang life. They're failing in schools, they're delinquent, they're truant, and that's really where you see the impact on communities.
We've seen some very emotive cases of illegal migrants committing terrible crimes, murders, and so on, that have really brought a huge media spotlight to what some view as the open border under the Biden and Harris administration. How has their border policies impacted crime over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, I would just like to say the left would say, "Oh, that's cherry picking. You've found these egregious cases." My response to that would be, one is too many. This is a consequence of a failure to enforce the most basic right of nations to control who comes into their borders, the basic right of the public to decide what level of immigration do they want, something that has been constantly ignored on the part of elites, whether it's in Britain or the United States. So all of these egregious cases, especially recently with the Venezuelans coming in, they are, in their first generation, clearly unbelievably violent people. Those are too many and are enough on that basis to demand a complete turnaround. And yes, the Biden-Harris administration reversed all of the sensible policies that Trump had put in, for instance, requiring alleged asylum seekers to stay on the other side of the United States rather than getting across, getting their foot in the door, and from then on they just disappear into the country. It was perfectly reasonable, the so-called remain in Mexico policy that Trump had put in. Biden immediately lifted it with the only possible agenda can be to ease the way for mass, low-skilled third world immigration into the United States.
You mentioned Venezuelans. Has Maduro been releasing prisoners and sort of gang leaders and so on to come into the United States? Has that been a sort of active policy?
I know that's alleged, and I don't have any knowledge of that one way or another.
In terms of the Venezuelans who are coming here and more organized crime, are there illegal sort of illicit gangs that have been operating within the United States that have grown over the last few years?
Oh, definitely. I bought my one and only drug purchase in San Francisco several years ago just to try to see how easy it was. And there, it was the Central Americans that were controlling the fentanyl trade. And I got a very good deal as a first-time buyer. I had $16 cash on me and ended up with what turned out to be 2 grams of fentanyl, which I got through with it under trepidation through TSA, but I wanted to bring it home here to Irvine, California. But there's definitely networks of criminal gangs that are working in the drug trade. Here in Newport Beach, California, there's gangs of illegal immigrants that are doing home break-in robberies. So that is definitely going on.
In terms of the people coming here illegally, are they more inclined towards a life of crime because of the way that they came here? Inherently, if you are ignoring the laws of the country to come in, then are you more likely to commit crimes when you're there?
Yes, you had mentioned what before we started, broken windows. It's another broken windows example. You've got an exact parallel between people coming into the country illegally with no regard for its laws and going on to commit crime, with the situation of people jumping the turnstiles into subways. I don't know what your British phrase is. I'm sure you've got a phrase other than turnstile jumping, to fare beat, to get into a metro system illegally. And those are the people who are committing crimes in New York subways and Chicago and San Francisco subways. If you're going to commit a crime, rob somebody or pickpocket them, you're not going to be assiduous about obeying the fare beating laws. The same thing with, coming into the country to commit crimes and to prey on native citizens. You're not going to be scrupulous about getting your paperwork and visa all in order.
In terms of getting into the psychology of why these people are committing some of these terrible crimes, is there part of it that they don't have any kind of connection with the United States, the local communities that have been here for many years or have always been here? Do they feel that they're just completely disconnected from society and therefore are able to abuse it?
I don't know. Obviously we have lots of native-born criminals as well. I mean, now there's a whole lot of alienation as well in the Black community. They're being told constantly by the President of the United States, by Black political figures, activists, that they are perpetually oppressed in this country, that they face a racist police force. Those claims are not true. Whether that leads to increases in inclination to commit crime, I don't know. I would say for Blacks, the problem is family breakdown overwhelmingly, and the loss of any informal mechanisms for socializing young males. For illegal aliens, I'm not sure that they started out with good intentions and then felt alienated and unconnected to our polity and developed a criminal inclination, or if instead they simply came without any kind of socialization and assumed that there's an enormous narcissism to criminals. There's a sense of entitlement, at least domestically in the United States, which is expressed by, you have $1 and I don't, I deserve it. And that may be coming on as well. We certainly have a massive international discourse that posits the West as the eternal oppressor of the third world. I would say that is as fanciful as the idea that America today is white supremacist. I'm not going to deny that it was white supremacist in the past. It was, in every aspect of its being. But amazingly, unforeseeably, America, the United States have done a complete reverse face. And with colonialism, it's really the same thing. The West, for a century, thanks to Britain taking the lead, has been the source of anti-slavery. Took the United States a long time to catch up to Britain's horror at this practice, to Britain's willingness to put its navy on the line, to put its military on the line, to try to suppress the slave trade, as Nigel Bigger wrote in his recent masterpiece. Britain was willing to occupy Lagos to try and disconnect the 19th century proto-Nigeria from its active, eager, greedy involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So it is not, the West has given the world not just unbelievable material prosperity and freedom from squalor, and want and physical debility, but it has also given the world the very concepts for fighting inequality and oppression, the concepts of tolerance and human rights and civil rights. These are exclusively Western concepts that the left fights in the name of, but still, there's still a very active discourse that talks about the gringo as the oppressor in South America. So whether people are affected by that with their lust for predation when they come into the United States, I don't know.
When it comes to immigration more broadly and how that impacts society in terms of crime, you look at Britain, you look at Northern European states who used to be ethnically homogenous, countries like Sweden or Norway or Denmark, Germany, France, and so on. And suddenly, over the last since the Second World War, they've had this huge influx of immigration from the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and so on. Do you think that inherently countries that are ethnically homogenous are safer, have less crime because they're more high trust, like Japan? Or are diverse countries, multicultural societies equally, high trust and okay with crime?
Well, that's interesting. I would say it's asymmetrical. I think it is true that multicultural societies do have low levels of trust. I'm sure your audience is aware of, and you are too, the famous or infamous study by Robert Putnam in this country, a very liberal sociologist who studied the relationship between a lack of any kind of national homogeneity on a community basis and the breakdown of trust. And to his despair and dismay, he found that on all ranges of disintegration, communities with higher levels of ethnic dissimilarity, national dissimilarity, they lost involvement in civic activities. They didn't trust each other. They were more likely to households sequester. So that's true, but it is not the case that merely being unicultural will provide you a safe environment. I mean, look at Haiti, look at the Caribbean countries, some of the worst, most barbaric civic violence we see in sub-Saharan countries. And I don't think there's certainly not a lot of racial diversity in those countries. They've got tribal diversity. And so you've got this primitive form of political organization giving rise to efforts at genocide. Everybody says the West is responsible for genocide. The only reason that other civilizations didn't accomplish as much is they didn't have the technology to do so, but the will to destroy the other has been just as bloody in other civilizations. So again, I mean, Haiti and Jamaica, these are countries with massive rates of homicide, and that's true as well in sub-Saharan Africa.
So I suppose the nuance might be that Japan and these Northern European countries that I mentioned were stable, successful, civilized, safe societies, and they were ethnically homogenous. And suddenly you introduce this new element of mass immigration from cultures that are completely different or anathema to those civilizations, and that may cause a rise in crime. Do you see where my logic is going there? Is there a correlation there?
Well, it's the people that are committing crimes. I've been thinking about this recently in our long-standing discourse about crime. We all talk about we want to fight crime. We want to fight crime. For some reason, we have to use euphemisms. We're talking about criminals. We turn it into some kind of generalization as if there's this abstract, reified thing that is crime, in order not to notice the fact that there are certain individuals, certain groups with very high levels of crime. So I don't know, how to get from a large situation like that. And I'm quickly trying to think of our history in the United States we had very high levels of European immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that induced a despair among progressives because what they saw was that these immigrants were bringing very high levels of government corruption to what had been fairly well-functioning urban governments. Uh, I can't really say whether street crime was seen as a product. Obviously, we had the mafia coming in. Jews, now we think of Jews as being so intellectual and law-abiding, but back in the 20s and 30s, there were lots of Jewish gangs. However, the mafia and Jewish gangs, their violence tended to be completely intra-party. The quality of American gun violence today is, yes, it is mostly, American gun violence is mostly black inner city kids shooting each other in gang rivalries. So it's still, in a sense, intra-party, but there's a lot more innocent victims being taken. So the whether immigration per se across ethnic and national boundaries causes those immigrants to be more likely to commit crime, I don't know. It may also be something in the sending cultures that have not developed to the extent that the West has in terms of respect for the law. We take for granted constitutional government, representative government. These are difficult concepts that require a level of abstract thinking that is beyond tribal. Tribalism is a very elementary form of social organization that's based on kinship. And it produces a whole lot of corruption, of favoritism, of nepotism. Max Weber understood the miracle of a civil service that was not out for itself. And you got this with Britain, with the colonial civil service. These were people, by and large, who were not simply there to line their own pockets. And the ideas that grew up in Britain about representative government, those are very advanced ideas, and they are still alien to a lot of the global South.
I want to ask about the difference between crime in cities and in suburbs in the United States, particularly crime impacted by illegal and legal migration. We all talk about sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago seeing a big spike in crime because they've been taking in many of these migrants. Is crime also reaching the suburbs as well, though?
Yeah, but we had, the summer of 2020, after the George Floyd race riots, the United States in 2020 saw a 29% increase in homicide, the largest in this country's history. A 29% change in anything that you're measuring in 1 year is just off the charts. And that rise was because of the lack of response to these just absolutely feral, savage race riots that spread from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where our vice president nominee on the Democratic ticket is from. He dithered for nearly 24 hours to send in the National Guard, despite having been requested by the very liberal mayor of Minneapolis, because the governor, Tim Walz, the current VP, vice president nominee running with Kamala Harris, was worried that sending in the National Guard would alienate the rioters and the so-called peaceful protesters, because being overwhelmingly black, these rioters and peaceful protesters would feel oppressed by a law enforcement occupying force. So the anarchy began in Minneapolis. It spread across the country. There was almost no consequences. The police in cities across the country were so overwhelmed. Few arrests, even fewer prosecutions. And it unleashed a huge crime wave of these mass break-ins, lootings of people driving huge SUVs into storefronts, storming into the store, grabbing everything they could from the shelves, from the display cases, running out, sometimes leaving the car because it had been disabled by their crash and getting away in a second, usually stolen getaway car. Then you had the leisurely stroll through the grocery aisles of people who, again, feel so entitled that they know there's not going to be criminal enforcement because now our law enforcement is completely inhibited in the United States by the absolutely destructive concept of disparate impact, which holds that if you enforce the law in a colorblind, neutral, constitutional fashion, and you have a disparate impact on Black criminals, not because the law is racist, but because Blacks commit crime at such higher rates, therefore we shouldn't enforce the law. That's going on. You have progressive prosecutors declaring whole categories of criminal offenses outside of prosecution. And so people are now engaged in massive theft, but on a very leisurely basis. I don't know if you've got this in Britain now, but you cannot buy a tube of toothpaste in many, many drugstores in the United States without needing to stand around for 10 minutes for a clerk to come and unlock the lucite shield in front of toothpaste because otherwise it's going to be stolen. Shampoo, razor blades, lotion, it's all under lock and key because the theft shoplifting problem is so big in this country. This was all a result of the George Floyd race riots. Crime in the suburbs, you had carjacking, you have Chicago suburbs declaring that there are certain times when you can go to a gas station, a petrol station, and fill up your tank because there will be a police presence there because otherwise people are terrified that if they get out of their car and fill up their tank, their car is going to be carjacked. So there's been a spate of, yes, crime, the lootings, the shopliftings coming into the suburbs. But again, Stephen, to be honest, the leading wedge in this remains native-born Black Americans, with Hispanics coming up second.
You talked about liberal prosecutors and Tim Walz. Kamala Harris used to be a district attorney in California, and part of her sell is that she's tough on crime. Do you feel that Harris and Walz are a sort of tough on crime ticket?
It's hilarious. That question, I love your sort of deadpan asking. Talk about an easy ball over the plate. It's absurd, but you're absolutely right. That is how the compliant, docile, embarrassingly servile press is allowing them to brand themselves without any follow-up questions. The Harris record as San Francisco district attorney was not particularly noteworthy. She actually faced criticism from the left for trying to enforce truancy laws against parents, something that I completely support. That was like her one good thing. She ran against an even more left-wing prosecutor in San Francisco and won. She then became the California Attorney General, which is kind of a ceremonial post. And there too, she didn't take public positions on some very dangerous, destructive citizen ballot initiatives that were passed in the 2000s that decriminalized, de-incarcerated out of this idea that we're going to have to fight so-called mass incarceration, which is simply a euphemism for putting too many Black criminals in jail. If we didn't have massive racial disparities in our incarcerated populations, disparities that I cannot stress enough to your viewers, Stephen, are the result of crime, not racist police. They are the result of disparities in criminal offending, which are massive. For example, black juveniles in the post-George Floyd race riot world are shot at 100 times the rate of white juveniles being shot by other blacks at that same disproportionate rate. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 in the United States die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites in that same age cohort. Their assailants are other blacks, they're not whites, and the police. So we've got a big, big problem on our hands here. But let's see, what I've got myself too far into a corner here.
My question was about Harris and Waltz and their sort of
Oh
record.
yeah, so she presided over some bad voter initiatives, but when she got really bad was with the George Floyd race riots, and taking up at that point, she was in the Senate, and she embraced wholeheartedly this phony, destructive narrative that law enforcement in the United States is systemically racist. She introduced laws in Congress to cut back on police power. Now, in the United States, we are very federalist. You know, we have very local government units when it comes to crime fighting. So crime is overwhelmingly an issue of city governments, to a lesser extent state governments, and the federal government, which is the U.S. Senate and the Congress and the president, is very remote. And the federal prison population in the United States of people that are committing federal crimes, whether it's illegal alien crimes or border crimes or counterfeiting, various financial crimes, and there are, of course, federal drug crimes and some crimes of violence, but those are the property crimes are mostly state. Our federal prison population is only 12%. The state prisons is where the action is, but nevertheless, so what the federal government can do when it's like being in its anti-cop mode is kind of limited. But Harris was still very, very bad on the rhetoric, which is incredibly important. Every time a major leader reinforces this lie that we have a racist criminal justice system, you are giving that message trickles down to the streets, and you're also demoralizing the cops. The other side of our massive crime increase that began with the George Floyd race riots in the United States is that cops are completely demoralized, Stephen. They have left the profession in droves. Minneapolis, where it all started, the George Floyd race riots, they're at their lowest point of manpower in 4 decades. People are leaving, and they are telling their family members, their friends, don't even think about being a cop, because as soon as you join the force, you're going to be deemed a racist from day one, and you are at enormous risk of your profession, of your freedom from phony prosecutions. If you try to engage in a criminal suspect and the interaction goes wrong and it looks bad on camera and you're facing a criminal prosecution. So Harris has been involved in that dangerous narrative, and Tim Walz has too. He signed in 2023. I mean, he's been passing, every year he signs a George Floyd Remembrance Day proclamation that celebrates the great civil rights hero, George Floyd. It's a very depressing thing in the country, Stephen, where, our civil rights heroes used to be real heroes. They stood up against American barbarism, against the barbarism of American whites, whose identity depended on nasty, cruel, gratuitous put-downs of blacks. And these heroes of the 1940s and 1950s, they abided by bourgeois norms, they dressed well, they spoke well, they made sure that they were models of the American polity, and they put the yahoos, the savages to shame, and ultimately they shamed us into doing the right thing. It took way too long, it took too many lives, but they were real heroes. Today's civil rights heroes, tragically, whether it's Michael Brown from Ferguson, Missouri, uh, in 2014, or George Floyd, or Freddie Gray in Baltimore, sadly, they're all criminals. And their claim to civil rights herodom is having been shot by the police after having resisted arrest. So, anyway, Tim Walz is part of the whole hagiography of George Floyd, who has a massive criminal record. He pled guilty to aggravated assault and robbery, pistol whipped a pregnant woman as part of a robbery crew that had broken into her home. And yet he's now venerated. We're going to have George Floyd statues, and we've got, George Floyd murals all over the place. So Walz venerates this hero, George Floyd, and his proclamations talk about systemic racism 5 times each, which again is a lie. And in 2023, he passed a bunch of laws further decriminalizing, further deprosecuting, even as the incarceration rate in Minnesota, the state, is dropping in tandem with the rising crime rate in Minnesota. So it would seem, if you were rational, you would say this is not the time to spring more criminals from prison and decrease the deterrent effect of the threat of incarceration, but that's precisely what Tim Walz has been doing. So no, this is not going to be a ticket that is going to get the United States out of its violent street crime problem.
From a British and European perspective, many Europeans view crime in the United States as being driven particularly by guns and gun crime. I moved to Washington, D.C. earlier this year, and I know people who work on Capitol Hill who have friends who've been murdered or attacked with guns, in carjackings and so on, which is a real shock to me, and very, very different to living in London, where the worst that happened to people was sort of muggings and maybe a stabbing, but that's pretty rare to happen to people not within the gangs and so on. And even I've been using the metro here in DC, and one guy one night tried to attack me. Again, lived in London for 6 years, used the underground every day, never had any experience like that. So to what extent, and this is just anecdotal from me, but I'm just saying, to what extent do guns kind of impact crime in the United States as compared to Europe? And, is this a gun problem?
It is off the charts. It is 2 separate worlds. It is absolutely the case that our violence in the United States is gun violence. Germany just passed a law regulating knives. And I think, you had that, I would say, infamous Metropolitan Police report in London that was phonily, that's not an adjective or an adverb, but falsely copping to the charge of systemic racism back in after that a bad cop incident with Mr. Lawrence, I believe his name was, anyway. But your issue there is knife violence in Britain as well. So the gun control advocates, can rightly say that our problem in the United States is guns, and it really is astonishing. I mean, you just don't have gun violence in other modern societies. Now, I'm not a gun nut. A lot of my conservative peers, their ideas, let's go out to the gun range and shoot, and I'm not one of those people. And I confess, and I this will be reviled by many of my peers, I don't quite understand why one needs to have a whole lot of military style weapons or 6 million rounds of ammunition at home. But I completely understand the argument of, no, I'm sorry, the burden is not on us to justify our desire to have guns. The burden is on the government to say why we can't. So I'm not going to get wholly into that debate, but I will say this on the part of the gun rights people. The NRA has an infamous slogan, guns don't kill people, people do. And the left loves to mock that slogan. But frankly, it's right. It's true. It's accurate. The efforts at increasing the burdens of gun ownership, of making lawful gun owners jump through more hoops, the background checks, all that. In theory, it doesn't bother me that much because, again, I'm not one of those people. If I were, I would be more likely probably be upset. But they're totally irrelevant. The people with a legal gun in their house, next to their bed or in their safe, that they have duly bought and registered, and they've gone through the background checks, they're not committing the drive-by shootings. The drive-by shootings are exclusively illegal gun owners. They're these kids. Here's the data, Stephen. In New York City, blacks are 22% of the population of New York City. They commit about 72 to 75% of all drive-by shootings. When you add Hispanic drive-by shootings to black drive-by shootings in New York City, you get about 100% of all shootings. White people are 34% of the New York City population. According to police statistics, they commit maybe 1 to 2% of all shootings. I don't even believe that. It's not happening in the white communities. If that's going on, it's not an urban violence. It's a husband or a wife in domestic violence incidents. And those actual drive-by shootings are through illegal guns. And the gun control isn't going to make a damn bit of difference. Here's what works for gun control to stop those illegal shootings: prosecution, putting people in jail, making the threat of jail real. And we don't do that because of the concept that I averted to earlier of disparate impact. The mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, a big Democratic operative under Barack Obama and Clinton, he became mayor of Chicago in the 2000s. And he and his police chief, Gary McCarthy, who was a very good cop that came out of the New York Police Department, they would periodically go up to the state legislature in Springfield, Illinois, and say, could we please have tougher laws against illegal gun crime like they've got in New York City? And the Black Caucus in the Illinois state legislature would always say, no can do. Because if we have stricter penalties for using illegal guns in robberies, in shootings, it will have a disparate impact on black criminals, and we don't want to do that. So we would rather allow more black criminals to shoot more black victims and put more black criminals in prison. Go figure. If I were a civil rights activist and you were starting ab initio, like from a Rawlsian thought experiment of the initial state, and you were going to say, okay, you're going to be a black civil rights activist. Whose side are you going to take? The side of black victims of crime or the side of black committers of crime? One could imagine they'd say, we're going to take the side of the victims. We're going to take the side of these dozens of black toddlers, 3-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, who since the George Floyd race riots have been fatally gunned down in their bedrooms, in their front yards, in their backyards, at birthday parties, in public parks, at barbecues. These black kids are getting gunned down in these savage drive-by shootings, and nobody gives a damn. There is no protest on behalf of these kids. The Black Lives Matter activists only show up in the incredibly rare instance when a black criminal has been shot by the police in circumstances that the media portray as questionable. So, yes, we have a gun problem here, but gun control is not going to solve it.
I want to ask about New York City. I don't know if you've ever seen that film Joker that came out a few years ago, but they sort of set it in this so-called Gotham City, New York City, same thing. And it's meant to be sort of 1970s. You see the terrible levels of crime, and it just seems like a complete hellscape. And in the 70s, New York really did have a huge issue with crime. And it was seen, it was very stereotypical, but you sort of see these scenes in Harlem and other places of just complete devastation. And then Bill Bratton and Giuliani came in and implemented this broken windows policy, which was very successful. And I want to ask kind of a bit about the history of what happened there with crime in the 70s, how that was solved. But in particular with the context today, with the rise of crime in New York City, have the local politicians there, I think it's Eric Adams, right, the mayor, have they been trying to implement broken windows again? Has that been successful? Are they going into the subway? Are they trying to solve these issues? Stopping people avoiding the fares and so on?
Well, 1990 in New York City, we had 2,245 homicides. I just want, your British audience to take that in. These numbers, the numbers in New York, in the United States for homicide are beyond comprehension. I don't know, Japan has, a dozen, maybe 24 homicides nationally a year at most. I'm being very, very generous of overstating what I think is probably the case. In the United States, there are dozens of blacks who are killed every single day in homicide. That's more than all whites and Hispanics combined, even though blacks are only 13% of the population. So in New York, we got up to 2,245 homicides a year. I can't do the math quickly enough to what that is a day, but it was bad. And so Rudolph Giuliani, it's tragic that you can't invoke his name now without calling up some contempt or sorrow or pity. But in the 1990s, he was at the top of his game. And he was a man of ideas, and he was willing to take on the massive welfare industrial complex and the criminal industrial complex. And he did choose a police commissioner, William Bratton, who had done work in Boston and in the New York transit system. And they said, we're going to start enforcing the law again, and we are going to go after the so-called quality of life or public order offenses on the understanding that there's a great chain of being in criminal offending, that people, as we talked about before, who are going to commit serious crimes are not going to be sticklers about smaller crimes. They're not going to carefully put their trash in the trash bin, or their, I forget what you call it in Britain. It's not anyway, you've got a different word for it. They're not going to carefully pay their fares. They're not going to carefully pay for, what they want to take out of a convenience store. And so the understanding of broken windows theory was not just that criminals are committing small level crimes, and if you can get them on that, you can prevent bigger level crimes, but also that allowing street disorder to take over. The initial metaphor from broken windows from a Atlantic magazine article by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling said that if you allow a broken window in one building to stay broken without being repaired, soon enough you may find that all the windows on the block are broken because people look around and say nobody's enforcing informally or formally norms of public order here. So if you allow a street to get graffiti infested, and the one thing that you guys in Europe and the UK don't get yet, that we have figured out in the United States to our enormous credit, is graffiti. My heart breaks every time I go to Europe at the amount of graffiti that you're just passive before. It's disgusting and it's tragic. Because graffiti sends a signal that you've had some juvenile delinquent here who has no respect for public or private property. Who knows how recently he's been here? But again, this is an environment where nobody cares. So Giuliani and Bratton said, we're going to start enforcing low-level laws against graffiti, litter, public urination, public drunkenness, gambling, turnstile jumping, vagrancy, aggressive panhandling, occupying ATM vestibules. And we're not going to allow this sense of disorder. And it had immediate results. Bratton, for the first time, the police commissioner, William Bratton, he did something that no police chief had ever done before. He set himself publicly a numerical goal. He said, my first year as police commissioner, this began in 1994, I'm going to lower crime by 10%. Nobody had ever taken on that responsibility. It was assumed, including by the law enforcement profession, that crime was a social problem that came from poverty, inequality, and racism, and the police could only respond after the fact. The FBI, our national federal government law enforcement agency, publishes an annual statistical summary of crime. And in the 80s, it published an annual disclaimer saying, well, we all know that homicides are a social problem and there's really nothing the police can do. Bratton and Giuliani said, no, we are going to protect the public and property. So Bratton said, I'm going to lower crime by 10%. He not only met his goal, he beat it. He lowered crime by 12%. Second year, he upped the ante. He said, I'm lowering crime by 15%. He met that goal and beat it. And they did it through proactive policing, through enforcing quality of life laws, through telling the police, if you see suspicious behavior on a street corner at 2 a.m., on a drug corner where people are known to have a drug set, and you see somebody hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun, for God's sakes, get out of your patrol car. Don't just drive on by. Get out of your car and ask some questions. Figure out what's that guy doing there. Maybe it's completely innocent. If it is, drive on. But if he raises your suspicion with his answers, you can ask him more questions. And if you develop reasonable suspicion, you can maybe pat him down. Be proactive. And that's what happened. And the crime drop in New York City was completely unforeseen. No criminologist had ever thought that New York City could lower crime the way it had. It was in the turn of the 1990s. It was assumed that violence was simply the American condition in its cities, and we proved otherwise. But the Achilles heel is we both locked people away, but we also had a massive deterrent effect where people simply were not committing crime. They were not, because there was a risk of being stopped and questioned and possibly frisked. Youthful gunslingers kept their guns at home, or they would not have them on their person. They would stash them under a mailbox or under a park bench because they were worried about getting stopped and found with a gun on them. Well, even that little delay in being able to react impulsively lowered gun crime. If you don't have your gun immediately on you and you feel dissed by somebody, your inclination, because these kids have not been given social impulse control, deferred gratification, maybe to shoot immediately. Well, if you have to go get your gun, that delays that impulse a little bit, and you're going to end up with less gun crime. So the threat of penalties, the threat of being stopped, deterred criminal behavior. But it did also result in more criminals going to jail, more stops of criminals, and they are in the United States. Sad to say, the facts are the facts. The bodies don't lie. They are disproportionately Black, and that allowed the race activists to start their crusade against law enforcement on the grounds of disparate impact. And what happened in New York, you had two mayoral administrations, Giuliani and Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who was much more liberal, but he understood two things. He could not let crime go up on his watch, and he could not let the welfare rolls go up on his watch. And he did not allow those things to happen because he supported the cops. But Bloomberg was followed by Mayor Bill de Blasio, who was a race crusader. And he started the great decline where the crime gains under Bloomberg and Giuliani were reversed. We've never gotten at all close to being back to 2,245 homicides, but crime has gone up under Bloomberg. And Adams is conflicted. He ran when he was in the police department. He was himself a sergeant. He was one of those radical blacks. Every police department has police precincts are, on the one hand, I've spent a lot of time in them. They can be a very optimistic experience, a hope-producing experience, because they are truly post-racial. You've got whites, Hispanics, blacks, all together, united in their belief that policing is colorblind and we're going to get the criminals. But several urban departments have a very strange contingent of radical blacks who buy into the law enforcement as racist name, and you wonder, well, why are you in policing in the first place? Well, when Adams was in the New York Police Department, he was one of those blacks, and he founded this organization called 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement, the CARE, that went around saying the police were racist. He perjured himself against Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, one of the great police commissioners in New York, telling a just fantastical, outrageous racial lie against Kelly. So Adams comes out of that background, but he ran as more of a law enforcement candidate, and he won because people wanted a crime fighter. But he's torn, he's played the race card himself as mayor, and he has not been as focused, as idea-driven, as organized as Giuliani and Bloomberg was. And so the thing about Giuliani, he was an ideas man, and he articulated publicly again and again a vision of government that was inspirational. He had the capacity on a completely spontaneous basis to lay out a vision of civil society, of mutual obligation and respect and rights and responsibilities. Mayor Eric Adams, our current mayor, cannot do those things. So it's been a mixed bag.
And just one last question. It's interesting, in New York, it seems that the Republicans are doing better, at least in New York State, maybe not so much in New York City. But just on another note, El Salvador seems to have a very big success with tackling violent crime. It's one of the safest countries in the Western Hemisphere after being one of the most dangerous, because Bukele, the president, came in and sort of put all of these gang people in prison. Can we copy the El Salvador model? Does that work, or will that work in other countries, United States, but other Central European or Central American countries? Sorry. Can you just talk a bit about what happened in El Salvador?
No, I can't. I don't know the details. And so I risk saying, yes, we can. I don't know whether he's used, extrajudicial, extra legal means. So I don't know, but I will say this. He's absolutely right. Punishment works. It would be really, prison is not an end in itself. Nobody wants to enlarge the prison population. It's not a good thing. Prisons are depressing. I've spent a lot of time in prisons talking to prisoners. A lot of them will say this was the best thing that happened to me. I would not otherwise have taken responsibility for my crimes. Now, some prisoners are very good at telling you the line they think you want to hear. So whether that seeming assumption of personal responsibility is sincere in every case, I don't know. And there's, the left-wing rap against prisons that it just makes things worse. It creates more criminals. I'm sure that is true as well. Our prisons in the United States are, in many instances, scandalous. They should be immaculately clean, well-run, and safe. But frankly, the population in there is a very difficult population. They are killers. They are ruthless. They have not internalized social norms. But ideally, we don't have prisons. And ideally as well, rehabilitation would work. It would be great if you could have restorative justice or social services that would make up for decades of failed parenting, lack of socialization, that would be able to create a new man out of somebody who has failed to pick up the basic attributes of being a civilized person, which is controlling your impulses. But sadly, there was a very honest liberal criminologist at Stanford University, Joan Peter-Celia, who died in the last couple of years. And she would do very honest, rigorous empirical studies of various non-incarceration rehab programs. There's an idea, a concept in criminology called evidence-based theory. So, are evidence-based practices. And the federal government has a little gold star, good housekeeping seal of approval if it can come up with a rehabilitation program that is an evidence-based practice that works. And Peter Celia spent years trying, and I think she came up with maybe 6 out of thousands that don't work. Here's what works: prisoner menopause. You put somebody in prison and he ages out. As people get older, they lose their aggressiveness, their willingness to break the law for their own personal end. So if we had alternatives to prisoner menopause, it would be great to use them, because it is heartbreaking to be in prison and see that lack of freedom. For some people, they don't give a damn. They don't have any respect for the aesthetics of normal human life, so it doesn't bother them. But they're not great things. But we don't have the alternative. So what they've done in El Salvador, assuming that they are following due process of the law, they're allowing people to make their case in court. But if they fail, the police are gonna work hand in hand with prosecutors, and they're going to impose significant sentences. That does work.
Heather McDonald, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.